a lot of people actually just do understand we have to have development, but those who don't like development, quite often it is the mass house builder products that they're not particularly happy with.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying, there's not a place for that. We definitely need them, but we need everyone to be able to help facilitate housing as we're going forward, I think.
I think so. Welcome back to ProBuild 360 TV and welcome back to the Onsite podcast. Our guest today is Sean Tofts. Sean, please introduce yourself and the Small Sites Alliance.
Hiya, yeah, so basically my name's Sean, as you said. I've had a background in town planning, architecture and urban design. I started off in local authorities. I've worked as a development manager, I've worked in planning policy, I've worked in urban design, and I do property development. I also work with a small group of developers on planning applications as well. And the Small Sites Alliance, which is I think mainly why I'm here today, is sort of an advocacy group which is mainly looking at making policy recommendations to national and the local government levels in relation to try and help small developers, so SMEs, but particularly at the sort of smaller end of the scale.
Yeah. So why don't you just explain for our audience a bit about things like land allocation, how it works, what the small sites metric is and what we want it to be?
Land allocation is actually a really interesting one because when we're looking at planning, obviously I don't know how much people know, it'll be different levels I'm sure, but there are two aspects to it. So you've got the local plan, which is a 15-year plan typically, and you're looking at a longer planning process, and we need that because you can't be planning everything on a day-to-day basis. But for small sites, they don't fit into that at all. So typically if you're doing a site which is sort of 10 homes or less, you wouldn't be getting an allocation or anything like that. So that's dealt with on a sort of ad hoc basis, and that just has to align with the policies which are in the plan. The issue with that, I mean, as I said, it makes sense, but the issue with that is that everything is geared towards the larger developers. They get the most say within the way that the local plan is written in terms of the policies within it, but also the site allocations are heavily based on them. So mostly for small sites, 10 and under, as I said, that will be windfall applications, and
it's what's left.
It's what's left, And as you know, usually you'll be expected to do a lot of front loading of that information at your own expense. So typically a council would like you to be, and in some senses they don't necessarily know better in terms of the way that option agreements work, or trying to buy a house outright and then come up with a scheme. But essentially they would like you to do a pre-app with all the stuff up front loaded first. And then just go in from that basis and make amendments as and when you can. And that's all at your own expense. So, for example, I've got a scheme at the moment where I think it's probably about 25 grand, maybe more, is front loaded for the planning application. We did have the benefit of doing a pre-app in that one as well. Not sure we're going to have met everything they've said, because obviously it's always a wish list. But that's 25 grand up front for a scheme that might be refused. Definitely this is a scheme of 2 homes as well. It's a lot of money. Whereas with the way that it works with local plans, site promoters and stuff cost money to the landowners and to developers, but there is pretty much more money behind that, and also more guarantee that they'll get something out of it at the end, and it's not costing them anything in terms of fees to the council. So the way that it's all sort of balanced at the moment is much more towards the big 6 developers, to be honest.
And that really ends up with less diversity in the product, because you've got a big developer, national house builder, will have 20 house types that it's just repeated. And as I'm sure you know, the SME house builders in the 80s were building 40 or so % of new homes, whereas now that's down to 8-9%.
I wouldn't be surprised.
And there's so much potential and so much great energy locked up in SMEs that we just want to be building, and it's quite unfortunate. The Small Sites Alliance has a policy called Room to Grow.
Yeah, that's
which
right.
is very
yeah.
interesting. So why don't you introduce that policy? Tell us where you want it to go.
Yeah, so Room to Grow is essentially, it's a permitted development policy, but we named it Room to Grow because permitted development rights basically has a really bad PR issue,
Yeah.
as you can imagine, and there have been some really bad schemes. I think in some ways, policy in the UK just is a bit mad. Like they came up with like, let's just convert any office into housing. It was like, there's always going to be issues with that.
Yeah.
And I can see why they did that versus, put on a lot of conditions where councils could refuse it. Obviously, they brought in Article 4 in the end anyway. But if you look at that as sort of the most extreme, so there was like examples of offices in industrial estates in Harlow getting converted and then people being like put into them. It wasn't ideal. So we wanted to try and move away from that. The type of permit development rights that we're trying to do are just much more sympathetic and sort of more like keyhole surgery. So, for example, there are lots of large detached houses out there, typically very much underoccupied by people who don't want to move into smaller homes, or they can't move into smaller homes in the exact area they're in anyway. And essentially, it was coming up with a list of criteria that would mean that you would be able to convert those homes into semi-detached homes with no need for express planning permission. It's essentially given as long as you meet these criteria. And they're really simple criteria. So again, I've just sort of came up with what I would think be a reasonable criteria, but homes which are 8 metres wide, so can facilitate it being split into two. And then you can utilise the existing footprint of the house and sort of the floor plans and use what would be typically permitted development rights anyway for that house. So you know as well as I do that with a detached house you can do an 8 metre rear extension with certain permissions. You can do a 4 metre one with no issue. You can do loft conversions. And the matter would be that as long as you could split that house into 2 units which are at least...
Just get a party wall in right down the middle, add a staircase.
Exactly. Make it so they're, say, 58 square metres each. You're able to go forward on that basis. A few other criteria, just because people... it's quite emotive, obviously, if you say, oh, it's going to be in the green belt or if it's in a conservation area. In terms of the numbers, roughly, it works out to there are about 1.6 million homes that would meet that requirement. So that's a huge amount of homes.
So that's
1.6 million.
1.6
So
million.
more than we need to deliver in this parliament that are sitting there. If you tick the box, said, this is a new criteria, we'd be able to start delivering.
Even if you took 10% of those and split them into two, it's a big contribution to the figures.
And I mean, the way that this isn't the only policy that's ever been like this. I'm actually having a conversation tomorrow with someone about street votes. I don't know if you came across that before. That was a policy which was a little bit more complicated. It's not one that I sort of endorsed or had anything to do with, but essentially it was about sort of re-densifying streets by allowing people to perhaps like knock down their block of semi-detached homes and build flats, for example. But it's the same sort of narrative, and that actually got quite a lot of traction with the national government. It's on the government's web pages. It's something they discuss. But to me, this seems like the most simple way of increasing housing supply and allowing SMEs to sort of thrive in that space. There's a lot of benefits to it. So obviously, instant boost. I think if they allowed that tomorrow, I could probably get 10 schemes going by the end of this year, to be completely honest. And that's just one person. You would be putting money back into local economies a lot more efficiently than you do with the large developers. Again, I don't want to be disparaging about, I think enough people disparage about them as they are, but I don't know what happens with that money as soon as it's sort of extracted. We know there's been huge amounts of money within that space. It's very much not the same case for SME builders. But if you look at it in terms of the local economy, if say you were going to do that in Birmingham in a suburb, you'd probably employ local contractors. You'd be working with an existing landowner who would potentially be someone who's looking to downsize. You're putting that money just basically gets recycled in the local economy a lot better. It's not extracted as such. And it also allows people to live within much more sustainable locations. Like the places we're already living generally are the most sustainable locations. I know you spoke to Rico, and Rico's brilliant when it comes to BNG, so I don't want to go into too much detail about that. I pretty much agree with him on everything, to be honest. But I would say BNG has probably been the most damaging policy to SMEs since I've been working as a planner.
Yeah.
So
yeah, BNG is very, very difficult to meet. Your private gardens give absolutely nothing to your calculation.
Yeah.
You know, what's left really, some little frontages, some planting around the boundaries and the borders and so on, but you know, those don't really add up, so it's very difficult to meet.
Yeah.
The statutory credits or even the privately provided credits are very, very pricey, so if you have to offset, you're going to be taking a massive hit, and then when you get to the DEFRA statutory credits, they're purposely priced at extortionate rates.
Well, the whole point of it being offsite is it's punitive anyway. And if you look at small developers and small sites, the whole idea of it is it's small, so you haven't got room to be delivering that anyway. So it is punitive towards small developers anyway. One thing I probably would note is that like self builders do get an exemption, which is great. I think if you want to go build your own home, that's brilliant. They don't need to make a profit though. And then self-build and custom through NASCBA, I can't remember, I think it's NASCBA. They managed to, at the last minute, get an exemption for custom build.
Custom build's a really interesting framework.
Yeah, completely agree. And I had one scheme which we got approved as custom build recently. If I'm honest, there is one council, I won't name them, that are now not allowing custom build because they think people are trying to circumvent B&G with it, which they might be, I don't know, and that makes sense to do so, to be completely honest.
No,
but one of the problems with custom build is that if you're a developer who's trying to sell a product, it's quite an airy-fairy thing until it's built. So you're meant to go to a bank or, you know, a bridging loan company and say, hi there, we'd like to borrow, we think about this amount of money to build what we think is about this. There's a lot, it doesn't work in the realms of reality, to be completely honest.
You've got to be a heck of a salesperson, A, to sell it to the funders, and B, to sell it to the end users.
Exactly, and you've also got to have the council agree that it meets the restrictions of what has to be custom self-built, because obviously it can't be you choose your own worktop, but does it have to go all the way to, you know, design it all yourself? So in terms of, I think it's one of those things that's very emotive. People think, oh, custom build, brilliant, but actually I think that it's just not practical that they get the B&G exemption and small developers don't.
Right.
There is another thing which I'd mention is that, like, in terms of the amount of homes that we deliver through SMEs and large developers at the moment, what they could do immediately is just say, okay, we exempt small sites, so 10 and under.
Yeah.
And we just push it up to 12.5% from 10% on large sites. That would be completely feasible. 2.5% more on a scheme of 100 homes is nothing.
Yeah. On that point, it does feel, not just on BNG, but other things, that the industry leans on SMEs for what should be being shouldered at much larger scales. So, for example, the Building Safety Act, which is a response to Grenfell and the Grenfell inquiry. Yeah. We know who's at fault. We've got a very interesting chart showing the web of blame.
Yeah, sure.
And, you know, but the legislation that's resulted from that, yes, there's a category of high-risk buildings which have the building safety regulator and everything having a more scrutiny. Yeah. But the levies apply to everyone. So we're paying the bill for what is happening at a very big corporate high-scale problem, and we're footing the bill for it. And it's the same thing with what you've just mentioned. So BNG, you've got these massive house builders that have practices like land banking, so they can just have big natural areas that they can offset credits, so they can build everything they need to build on the sites that they do choose to build out. And they also have the capital there to make contributions and to build things in. Let them deal with that. And if you allow SMEs, particularly with things like the room to grow and other policies that are sort of retrofit policies, where we've got existing stock, if you're concerned about net zero and the environment and those sorts, and protecting our natural habitats, well, then free those things up, because the buildings are already there. So it's less development that's needed in green spaces.
I think the problem is that SMEs don't really get much, particularly the small side of SMEs, because let's be honest, SMEs can be everything from one person building one house every 2 years to someone delivering 1,000 homes a year is at the very high of end of M. Those at the very low end, I don't think they get very much in terms of advocacy. And that's very clear in the way that BNG was dealt with. Actually, I did work at a council in planning policy when BNG was sort of announced.
Berkshire?
It was in Essex. But we went down to London, spoke to Natural England, basically highlighted very many of the issues which we've still got now and have just been ignored. So it's not just, if it makes it feel any better, it's not just small builders who are getting ignored, it's everyone, to be completely honest.
You know, it's not just the final product of the houses. You know, it's the jobs and the businesses. As I was saying before we started recording, you know, so many SME house builders are giving up on house building, and they're either changing their strategy or changing their area of activity and taking their skills into other aspects like commercial, or just looking at it from a rental and property portfolio point of view, but not building new units.
Exactly. I think that's where policy like room to grow could work really well, because I think, as I said, there are emotive things around all of this. I guess we didn't really cover the NIMBY thing completely, but there is emotive things about this in terms of, I think a lot of people, when they see on social media developers and stuff, they see people turning houses into HMOs, and there is a need for that. But at the same time, and particularly because we're not delivering enough homes, you know, I'd love it if people weren't living in any HMOs. But if you're not delivering the homes, then people are going to need to live in HMOs. That's the most efficient way to give people homes. And you know, that gets knocked as well. But you are bringing what are quite often really dilapidated homes into use to a high standard. Varying standards, obviously, but what would be better is if we could get a policy that was like Room to Grow, where you could get people who've got that skill set and the type of developers and builders who can work on those sort of schemes, and allow them to work on actually delivering fully new homes.
Let's say tomorrow you're housing minister and your pen is your pen is going to be putting together a policy reform bill, and you're going to be putting in some changes that will direct us towards a more productive industry. What are those 3, 5, 10?
Let's not add too many more. What top 20 things?
It's not necessarily adding policy. It could be just striking policies.
Just making them sensible. I think one thing that we probably haven't picked up, I promise I will answer the question, but one thing we haven't picked up on is the way that policies are formulated. So you've got policy people pushing that, but also in reality, it's not Keir Starmer sitting there going, how can we solve the housing crisis? They've got people influencing them, and a lot of those people already work in the civil service, and they're the same people who've been sitting in the civil service, saying computer says no for the last 10, 15 years. I would maybe have a look at doing a restructure of the civil service. But I would have a look at who's actually making the decisions, and is it, there are thousands and thousands of people working at MHCLG, and I'm not saying we don't need them, but when you're even in a council, there are so many decision makers and heads making different decisions. No one puts their head above the parapet, so nothing really changes. So I would look at bureaucracy. The way. Yeah, exactly. I would look at, is this, and that's not a problem in itself, other than what are the impacts, and the impacts are you end up with unjoined up thinking. So we've had a brownfield passport consultation. We've got the BNG one that went. I'm not seeing anywhere anyone's going, okay, so we've got all of this, how does it all tie in? And I think it's because no one is doing that, to be completely honest. And that's not even one authority. You've got Natural England, DEFRA, MHCLG. It is a real mess. I really wish Rico was here, actually, just to do a summarising of it all. But okay, what I would do, though, is BNG, I would put pause. I put pause on it because also you've got to be politically acceptable.
You're very diplomatic.
Put a pause because I've actually spoken to them at CLG and I explained to them the exemption for small sites and how it would work, and they said in a meeting, that would work. We're just worried about the optics. I was like, well, the optics are you're actually trashing the whole of SMEs at the moment, and you're not going to deliver the 1.5 million homes that you need to deliver. And again, in another meeting with people from DEFRA and MHCLG, some of them just rubbish that. They're like, every government wants to build 1.5 million homes. And I just sort of think, if you're thinking like that, you should be out the door, actually. So they'd be out the door first. Pause on BNG, just to work out what's a more sensible way of doing it. And my feeling is that putting 2.5% on the large developers who could easily handle it, and making small sites exempt from the metric, and go back to how it used to be. Like, I'm sure you remember, it used to be you have to put in back boxes, you have to do landscaping, things like that. go back to a more pragmatic solution, which also doesn't dumb down ecology, because
Yes.
ecologists don't like it either
Yes.
in the large part. And maybe have a look at how other ways we could do BNG. So you could have that some stuff would work in gardens that isn't in there at the moment.
I definitely think bringing the private gardens into the metric.
So BNG. So I did speak to someone from one of the civil service departments who said we're looking at ponds. And I was like, that's a very random thing to be looking at, and a very easy thing for someone to just go, well, we're going to fill that in.
Yeah.
But you could do, for example, BNG TPOs or hedges. So conservation areas, you can't touch a tree without permission.
Yeah.
Can't see why we can't do that.
Well, if local trusts like Bourneville and Calthorpe Estates
exactly. The hedges. It all works,
It
and
works
maybe we
very
just
well.
need to look at doing it in that way. And it's not to say that someone wouldn't be able to, take out a tree or something, but they've got to do a permission for it, and then do something at that point to sort of rectify that.
Yeah.
But I find the whole thing a bit condescending towards homeowners, really, to be honest, because they can't be trusted to have anything in their garden.
They think everyone's going to slab their entire garden with
which
council
some
paving
people
slabs.
do, but a bit of I don't want to say education even, but just a little bit of enforcement
Well,
of don't do that.
It's a cultural thing, isn't it? At the end of the day, I
Yeah.
think the British love a good English garden.
I think a lot of people do, yeah, for sure.
I don't think you might put a little garden room with a little deck and stuff, but I think people want a nice garden if they bought a house.
For sure.
Well, those are all very sensible. And I think that if those things were at least brought to the table, there'd be a bit of a shift.
Yeah,
for the
hopefully.
better. Well, why don't you tell our audience how they can connect with you and that sort of thing?
So, www.smallsitesalliance.com is probably the best way. I'm on LinkedIn, Sean Tofts. Other than that, send an email, fill in the form, and happy to go from there.
Well, we need as many people behind us making as much noise as possible to get these
agreed.
sorts of policy reforms
Yeah,
up and
completely agrees.
running. So, Sean, thank you for being with us.
No worries, thank you.